Hello AS, welcome to your Neurons exam question mark scheme. So if we have a quick look at this one. First question, we've got motor. Don't worry about the other term in there, you just need to know about motor neurons carry messages to the central nervous system. That is false. They do not carry messages to the central nervous system. They carry messages away from the central nervous system, away from the brain about movement. So the brain says, I want the arm to move, so motor neurons take the message from the brain to the arm and say, move, 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 and then it moves. Okay. The nucleus of the neuron is found outside the cell body. That is also false. It is found inside the cell body, and I'm sure none of you were tricked by that, but just note the term soma. So that is another name for cell body, which we talked about as well. Okay. Outline the structures of the process involved in synaptic transmission. You are all going to be an expert in this one. The two key things to note are if you're going between 5 and 6 marks, then to be able to access those, you must make reference to both pre and postsynaptic processes. So you must tell me about the action potential running down the presynaptic neuron, the vesicles and all of that, and you must also tell me about the postsynaptic, the neurotransmitters binding to the postsynaptic neuron. If you don't mention both of those, you are stuck below 4 marks. Okay, so where you say there 3 or 4 marks, the focus is on pre or postsynaptic processes with some inaccuracies. So if you only talk about the pre or you only talk about the postsynaptic processes. Third bullet point, I thought, fifth bullet point, which I thought you might be quite interested in. Diagrams can describe the structure effectively, but text is necessary to explain the process. So you can have a diagram and then text to explain it, and I would be tempted to do both. So the way I would hopefully go about it, and interestingly enough there are 6 bullet points to go with that. So the action potential runs down the presynaptic neuron. This triggers vesicles to move to the edge of the presynaptic membrane. The vesicles release neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. So far I'd say you've got 3 marks because you've talked only about presynaptic stuff. The neurotransmitter binds to the postsynaptic neuron, or the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. I'd make brief reference to, depending on whether they're excitatory or inhibitory, the postsynaptic neuron is more or less likely to fire. The neurotransmitters are released by the receptors back into the synaptic gap, where they are reabsorbed back into the vesicles in the presynaptic neuron in a process called reuptake. If you haven't referred to the names presynaptic, postsynaptic, if you haven't used that terminology, you've just said the neurons most of the time, then I would say you'd be limited to 1 or 2 marks. That is so significant, pre and postsynaptic neurons. You must use that terminology. Otherwise, it's thinking, have I mentioned all those things, ticking them off as you go. Next one, your absolute favourite, summation. So briefly outline how excitatory and inhibitory are involved in synaptic transmission. The maximum that you could get for this, if you've only defined excitatory and inhibitory, is 3 marks. You get 1 mark for saying that they can be excitatory or inhibitory. You don't get any marks. The note there from the mark scheme, most can be both, but GABA is purely inhibitory. You don't really get any marks for naming, as I'm sure I've said already, naming the different types of neurotransmitter and whether they're excitatory or inhibitory, because they could be most are either excitatory or inhibitory in process. Okay. If you've explained if the neurotransmitter is excitatory, then, and you must say postsynaptic neuron is more likely to fire an impulse or action potential. To get the marks about excitatory, you must mention postsynaptic neuron, and you must mention either impulse, or you could say action potential, I don't mind which. If neurotransmitter is inhibitory, then the postsynaptic neuron, you must mention postsynaptic neuron, is less likely to fire, and you must mention impulse or action potential. If you've mentioned all 3 of those things, then you can get 3 marks. The final mark is saying the excitatory and inhibitory influences are summed, are added together. Ideally, I'd like to see the phrase summed. I'll probably still just about give you the marks, but I want you to make a note, if you use added together, that the phrase is summed. If the net effect, and you want to have used the term net effect, the net effect on the postsynaptic neuron is inhibitory, the neuron will be less likely to fire. And if the net effect is excitatory, the neuron will be more likely to fire. And you can use slightly more shorthand with this one because you've already used you've used postsynaptic and you've used action potential. So I will be flexible where you use them, but you must refer to them at least once, either when defining it or when explaining the process of summation. And then you've got labelled there, so you've got the vesicles in box 1 and you have the receptors in box 2, and that is it. Well done.